the formula for us was to discover things. If you're going to make the original Kings of Comedy, Pootie Tang Collection, or Napoleon Dynamite, you better make them cheap because they are risky. And so as a result, when they succeed, they're really profitable.
Welcome, everyone. We are back to the Music Lounge. Hope everyone's had a good couple weeks. Perry, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Andrew. We are recording late winter, early spring, so it's been a transition time here in New York. We've had it was in the 80s 2 days ago, and then snowed.
Yeah.
But no, I'm doing great. And as usual, I'm going to start with saying, anyone listening, please like, rate, share, and review the podcast so that we can reach a bigger audience. And we've got some great guests who have been on the show. So I'm sure that other people would love to hear their stories. And speaking of great guests, today we have the former EVP of MTV Films joining us, and we're very excited to welcome David Gale to the show. Hi, David.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Good to have you.
You are entirely welcome. So let's just jump right into it. So everyone we talk to for the podcast has sort of an interesting and original story about how they got into the entertainment business and made their way to MTV. You started your career in entertainment law and then sort of landed at a big Hollywood talent agency. But I know your dream was to produce films. How did you move from ICM to the creative side of the film business? And then how did you end up at MTV?
Actually, I should go back just even a little bit more than being an entertainment lawyer, because of course I went to law school and did that because I didn't know what to do with my life, but it wasn't a dream of some kind to be a lawyer. And I got out of law school and got a job actually at a big Wall Street firm, which I absolutely hated, and I couldn't imagine my life being that way for forever, even though I'd make a lot of money. And after a very hard weekend, I decided spontaneously that what I really want to do was be a movie producer. And it wasn't based on anything except possibly years before I'd seen Saturday Night Fever in the theaters. And that movie just blew my mind. But it never occurred to me that actually people have a career making things like that until I was desperate and going back to the city, New York City, dreading Monday morning. And so I said, I want to be a movie producer. And within a few months, through networking, I found a small entertainment law firm in New York that was incredible at the time. They represented Cyndi Lauper, Talking Heads, Eurythmics, Judas Priest. My first job was to watch all the first 5 years of SNL and create a clip video, best of John Belushi, best of Dan Aykroyd. So all I did was watch SNL for like 3 months, clearing clips for the best of videos. And, it was amazing. Driving on the back of the motorcycle with a lawyer who actually was in Cyndi Lauper videos. And it seemed like, while it wasn't the dream come true that I thought it was, in many ways it was back in those days in the 80s. And, but, over time I realized, I got to pursue that dream of being a movie producer. But here I was a lawyer, and what do I know about producing? And I said, well, got to go west, young man, and moved to California to have this job at ICM in business affairs. And that was a step closer. And I actually represented so many incredible actors, writers, directors. And one of those directors was Ridley Scott. And at some point, he asked if I wanted to come work for him in his production company. I'm like, but this is it. This is the moment when I get to transition from being a lawyer to being a movie producer. That didn't work out. I actually got fired within a year, and it's a long, sad story, a very typical Hollywood story of what happens when personalities clash. Not with him, by the way.
Yeah.
He was very nice, but I'm out of a job. I'm thinking that maybe this isn't such a good professional choice to be a movie producer after 10 years of keeping that dream alive. I was going to go move up to Carmel, California and open a little practice there where it's quiet. And then I got a call from a lawyer friend who said Gale Ann Hurd was looking for someone to run her company. And Gale produced Terminator and Aliens and Walking Dead. And okay, maybe I'll delay that Carmel experience a little while and went to work there. And it was a fascinating time. I met some of my best friends and ultimately learned for the first time how to be a movie producer. And so the dream was starting to come true, but I wasn't fully sort of there yet in terms of having my own sort of direct involvement in making movies. I mean, I was directly involved, but it wasn't my choice. They weren't my choices necessarily.
Right.
And then I got a call from a former MTV person named Eve Zerly, now Eve Coquillard, who was in development. And she told me I should meet this guy named Joe Davola. And Joe, if you've heard of him, is iconic, certainly at MTV from almost the very early days. And Joe was looking to build a film division. And so I met Joe. I met Doug Herzog, who was there at the time, and Judy McGrath, and they hired me, which was amazing. And here was the task, start a film division for MTV. And that was the beginning.
Wow. My first job in entertainment was as an assistant at what was then Triad and then became William Morris.
Uh-huh.
But I was in New York, but I was working for two film agents. Was amazing. I mean, it's amazing experience to do that, to be at an agency, because you learn so much about the film business. I mean, and even though I wasn't like negotiating deals, it helped me learn how to just deal with people both from a creative standpoint, but from a business standpoint also. Yeah, it was amazing.
The word crazy before people because
I mean, I've certainly had my share of people yell at me, and no one ever threw a phone at me though, or whatever. So that was good.
You didn't work for Scott.
Well, yes. Now you know who I'm referencing.
I was going to ask, when you started at MTV, how on the map were they with being the go-to media platform for pop culture and celebrity, and what shows were already hitting big at that time?
Well, it was 1995, so it was really sort of the beginning of the incredible success of a lot of television shows.
Mm-hmm.
I knew MTV from the days when it was music videos, and it still was music videos a lot of the time during the early 90s into the mid 90s. But shows, shows like The Real World and Jackass and Beavis and Butthead were becoming really important staples to the youth culture landscape. And so it was really at that moment in time when it moved from what I think most people perceived as a music oriented network to a pop culture network, really breaking ground in almost every area it got involved in.
Yeah. Were you given a task to look for movies to produce that were, fitting with our culture, or could you step outside that? Because obviously doing things like a Jackass movie and a Beavis and Butthead movie were no brainers.
Good question, because honestly, what happened was I got hired by Joe, Doug, and Judy, and then Doug left 3 weeks later. Joe left 6 months later, and Van Toffler took over, and there was no mandate. I mean, it was just be successful. And I think one of the beauties of MTV is that often the case. Nobody's dictating from above what you should make. They just want you to be attuned to youth culture, to music, to the sensibility of the audience and the diversity of the audience, and channel that into whatever area of the company you're working in. And so often the culture is from the bottom up, unlike almost every other company, because the younger people, the people who are in the trenches or just assistants at that moment, some of whom became very successful people, but it was empowering to anybody at the company to bring up their ideas. And as a result, I had to do the same thing. So without a direct mandate, I really had to figure it out on my own. And one of the things I noticed very early on, and maybe I instinctually knew this, was to hire great people and to make sure that those people were passionate about the brand, passionate about making films in our division, and really liberate them from any sort of corporate constraints that they normally would have to be working under. MTV just wasn't that way. And in fact, if you tried being too corporate, you probably wouldn't last there. And of course, Van was a huge proponent of empowering people who worked for him. And so he left it to me. In fact, I was physically 3,000 miles away because I was on the Paramount lot, which is where our offices were. And everyone else was in New York. There were few MTV people out in the West Coast, like some of the communications people, but it was up to us to figure it out. And one last thing before you probably have more questions, is that actually MTV had made a movie or released a movie with its name on it before it was released while I was after I arrived, but it was a movie that had the name on it, which was Joe's Apartment. And for real old timers, they remember the short that was on the network, which all those interstitials and short films that broke out so many filmmakers and others. It was a great short. It was really funny, dancing, singing cockroaches. And, in New York City. And it was licensed to David Geffen for Warner Brothers to make. And so when the movie was screened and the MTV people saw it, I think they were like, cringe. This is not what we want as our brand, just take shorts from MTV or whatever. So it came out, it was the first MTV film, but MTV had nothing to do with it except promoting it. And it was a failure financially, creatively, really. And that was clear that we couldn't do that. So, it was up to us at MTV Films and Van, really. Everybody else was an observer at that moment.
Yeah.
What was the first movie you had your hands on?
Well, the first movie that when I was hired, it was already determined that Beavis and Butthead should be a movie. So I had Mike Judge had written the script and was going to direct. And so my first job was to produce Beavis and Butthead Do America. And of course, nothing could be more fun than that. And I hired a great staff that was helping me with it, a woman named Momita Sengupta. And Mo stayed at MTV like 20 years and went to be head of production of all of MTV networks. And she started as my assistant and, got into editing and all the other things related to the movie. And that was my first experience. And of course, it was a big hit. It broke box office records for December when it came out. And I was like, this is easy. But then in the meantime, we started developing our first live action feature. And that didn't go so well for many reasons. In some ways, it taught me a lot of lessons about the business. And so it was important to have that first failure. Of course, a lot of pressure because you want to prove yourself. So that was Dead Man on Campus. And while in some young people say, oh, I love that movie, Mark Paul Gosselaar, and it was interesting because there were some stories behind it, but it was fun and not at the same time, but it was cutting my teeth, and that was important.
So after Beavis and Butthead, which was obviously a monster hit, it kind of took a minute to develop MTV's voice with original stories and ideas. So we kind of alluded to this a little bit, but sort of take us through the process of what you thought would be a good MTV film, why you thought it would be a good MTV film, some of the films that you produced and released at that time. And then specifically, I just want to talk about Election a little bit because it sort of transcended what MTV Films was, only because not only it wasn't like a huge hit, but culturally it seemed to resonate with people. And it obviously, was it Alexander Payne who directed the film? And that basically started his career. And then Reese Witherspoon obviously was in it, who was amazing. And I think it showed a new side of her to people also.
The challenge of building a film company is just having good taste and lot of luck, and you end up with some hits. And if you get enough of them, then people think you're a genius. That is absolutely not the truth. So much of it is the work of other people, but also timing and marketing and cultural moments that you're sort of tapping into. And we'll talk maybe later about Napoleon Dynamite and other films that we were doing. But the point for us was different than most production companies. We had to build a brand in film. MTV already had a brand, obviously, but very few people, in fact, for a long time, it was almost a problem to have the MTV brand.
Mhm.
Partly it was the pressure of living up to the brand, but also because the brand in television is very different than it needed to be in film. If all we did was try to make movies that reflected what we made on television or were the same sensibility, that would be a disaster in and of itself. And Joe's Apartment was like the precursor to that. And Beavis and Butthead was, of course, the example of success in that. But, you mentioned the Real World movie. And when it came to us to produce it, it was like, oh, of course, MTV Films is going to produce it. I'm like, not on your life are we producing that movie. That is not only does it sound like a bad idea for a movie, but it is exactly what people expect and what
Right.
people are going to criticize us for. So the point was to be unexpected, to be original, to find new voices. These were all things that MTV did very well, but they did it in the TV world, in the cable TV world, and to some degree in other areas, but mostly it was cable television. And in the movie business, everybody's out for your head, by the way. Like it is the word schadenfreude, if you know, that is really taking pleasure in other people's failures. And so the movie business is filled with that. And if you don't have a little of it yourself, you're kind of probably, lying to yourself, because it's such a hard business to be successful at that it's not that you want other people to fail, but you just want to not feel like a failure yourself for not being able to do it right all the time. And so I feel like my job was to protect the MTV brand at all costs, but to, have a different course, a different approach to it, because they didn't connect after that first sort of general attitude of great talent, voices, cultural moments, all that stuff. So in doing that, we had to play both to what is the obvious, and we did movies that were very obvious, but that were successful for that reason, like Varsity Blues and Save the Last Dance and Orange County, Coach Carter. So we did, The Longest Yard with Adam Sandler. Those movies were exactly what the studio wanted from us. They didn't want to have to try very hard to figure out how to market something. But that would have been really, I think, doing the brand a disservice, because the brand has to be about discovery and new voices, especially young voices in film, and people who are emerging, some of whom came from, the MTV world itself, but most of whom were just coming out of film school or, were people's assistants. And so it was really important to find those gems or find those voices and make sure that over long term, and you have to have a long-term view, that people saw MTV as something different and unique in the film world, not necessarily in the TV, not in the TV world, but that was kind of the approach. And that's challenging when people are they want you to give them hits.
Yeah.
And we couldn't just give them hits. That doesn't happen no matter what. But certainly Van used to say, if you shoot for the middle and miss, it's way worse than shooting for something really high and miss. And so, in that case, you get pootie tang. So it's really important to have the pootie tangs of the world for you to build a brand.
I want to get back to election, but how, so your co-deal was with Paramount, right?
Yeah.
Paramount released. So did they have any sort of say in also the types of films that you were developing, or were you able to sort of cordoned off from the rest of what Paramount was doing?
Well, that is a question that I could go on and on about. But the short answer is that was a shotgun wedding that happened when Viacom bought Paramount the year that I started, and it became important to work together as a company. That was a bad business decision in my opinion, because having the freedom to ask Paramount to do what they wanted to do, and they wanted to do it, would have been a great combination of strengths. But forcing us to do it meant there were a lot of movies that we missed as a result of their different opinion about what an MTV film should be. So Little Miss Sunshine and Juno and Blair Witch Project, these were all projects that we brought to Paramount, and they said no to. We'll get into Twilight later, but we did end up forcing our way out of Paramount a few times because we just needed to sort of show them that we know what we were talking about. And so Napoleon Dynamite was an example where they didn't want to do that movie in any way. We had bought it at Sundance, and they're like, what are you talking about? This is crazy. This is a ridiculous movie. This is not going to make any money. So we made a deal with Fox Searchlight. And then Paramount went up in arms and like, you can't do that. You can't work outside the company. I'm like, well, we're doing it. We made a deal. And so Paramount said, well, the only way we're letting you do that, like they had the power, they really didn't, but they thought they did. And so the only way they would let us do it is if they took international, so that they had a stake in the movie, which of course, it flopped internationally, but it was important for us. And, the original Kings of Comedy, MTV financed itself with Bernie Mac, Cedric the Entertainer, Steve Harvey, and we forced them into that one. And so occasionally we got out of the system, but mostly it was an arranged marriage. But to your point, we did work very closely with the executives, and there were a lot of great executives. They really did care as well. So I'd say 80% of the time it was a wonderful relationship. 20% of the time it was fraught, but we worked it out, and we ultimately did release like 27 films. And I'm very proud of the sort of relationship that we developed for the first 10 years.
So how did you find the election script? How did you find Alexander Payne, and how did you guys go about casting and making that film?
Well, that film's a perfect example of sort of culture clash and also expectations, because the movie started as a book by Tom Perrotta that had been unpublished at the time. And some producers, Albert Berger and Ron Yerxa, brought it to us. And I looked at it. It's about a high school election. Actually, the book took place in the 1980s under Reagan, and it was all sort of around that time. So we optioned the book. And at Sundance that year, I saw Alexander Payne's first film called Citizen Ruth, and we all decided he'd be a great choice for adapting Election. And so he went off and did it. First script was amazing, totally transformed from the book, very close to the movie as you saw it. But the studio was like, we're not making this. This is a terrible idea. What is this about MTV? Because even though it's about high school, it's also a very adult film on many levels. And so when we developed it, Alexander didn't give a shit about MTV. He just wanted to make a signature movie that he saw as relevant to a lot of audiences. And that's what we leaned into. And back to your point about what kind of movie is an MTV film, I thought this was the perfect example of counter programming to what is obviously, an MTV film like Varsity Blues. And so when we finished the movie and it went through some other machinations, Paramount was like, we screened it, and it screened miserably. People started walking out. There's this infamous scene where, the teacher says, how do I say this in a podcast? And, she gets so wet, and it's like a teacher talking about a student. And it was this like, people started screaming and walking out of the movie theater because they had thought of MTV Film was going to be like this nice youth-oriented film. And here it was. And so the studio thought they had a disaster on their hands, and so they wanted to bury it, and we're going to send it direct to home video.
Wow.
And we got into Sundance, and they're like, you're not going there, because once we go to Sundance, everybody's going to know the cat's out of the bag. It's a terrible film. We'd be embarrassed. So we didn't go to Sundance, but they released the film just for 4 theaters in order to get the deals they had for home video and everything. They released it in 4 theaters. They're going to bury it and send it to home video. And the critics loved it, and all of a sudden it's this thing. And so they ended up releasing in a relatively small number of theaters. So its box office was curtailed a lot, but somehow or another, got Academy Award nomination. It became, this cultural touchstone with Tracy Flick. And that's the way it works sometimes. And the pain that we suffered as a result of making that movie and trying to release it was one of those kind of Hollywood stories that most people would never believe. And at the end, I mean, there were executives who were champions of the film, but the senior people who are marketing, et cetera, were appalled. And so, you learn to live with people shooting at you. As I said, people love to see you fail sometimes. And that was hard, but it was at the same time exhilarating to have that moment at the Academy Awards where we get nominated and we won all the Spirit Awards, best picture, best screenplay, best director. And it's like,
wow, that's amazing.
You just don't realize at the time,
I know I'm harping on this. How did you, I mean, obviously it was Alexander Payne who wanted Reese Witherspoon, but how did you guys decide that she was right for it? Also, Matthew Broderick was such an offbeat casting too for that kind of a role. And then you discovered Chris Klein for the movie too.
Yeah, well, there's so many stories somebody needs to write a book about election because there's so many things. I mean, somebody died during the course of production. There was tragedy. There was a snowstorm in October and all the trees in Omaha, Nebraska fell down and we had to paint leaves on trees and attach apples to trees. And it was, have heat torches melting the snow. It was a nutty play. It was a nutty situation. The casting, Reese was a pretty early favorite. She'd done one small movie before that people sort of saw something about her. And she was she created the Tracy Flick role, though, in many, many ways. Her point of view of it was really what made the role so great, and Alexander's direction sort of brought that out in her. But the studio, even though they didn't want to make the movie at all, were like, okay, go get Tom Cruise, go get whoever the names were, and we had to go to them. It was embarrassing to sort of even think that this was going to be what they wanted, and wrong. And and then Alexander's inclinations were to go really indie, and we're like, no, you can't do that. And so the ultimate choice of Matthew Broderick was kind of genius because everyone knew him from, Ferris Bueller. And so to have it flipped on its head when this Ferris Bueller was now the teacher at the school was sort of an insider joke on some level for those who grew up on that. Chris Klein was a local student at Omaha School, and Alexander asked the teachers at the various high schools who they knew, and Chris was one of them. And so it and Tammy, who is the sort of lesbian sister, that was also she was a fresh out of high school. Actually, we had originally cast Thora Birch, and that was another story that I probably shouldn't bring out, although it's so old now, who cares? But she didn't work out. And so then we had to find somebody, and we ended up finding somebody unknown.
And the film also was, I think, a landmark for MTV Films because it was the first film that really, not the first film that critics responded to, but the first film that you were like Spirit Awards and all of that stuff. Like, it really kind of put you guys on the map at a different level, I think.
Definitely. This was 98, 99. We actually ended up releasing like 4 movies in a row that sort of, when you look at them, they're so different from each other that it was really a moment when I felt like we could be many things, but most importantly, we needed to be creative and original. And that didn't always mean that it was going to be good or successful. But I think over time, as Van had pointed out about not shooting for the middle, we did shoot for the middle a couple times, I must say. We didn't want to, but the studio wanted very clear successes, or at least things that would sort of be obvious to market. When we ended up doing those films, we were doing films like 200 Cigarettes, which not a good film, but it was, Kate Hudson and Courtney Love and Ben Affleck and so many other incredible names.
Yep.
And, they play it on VH1 every New Year's Eve, and it still has its moments. Elvis Costello's in it, but those efforts, they sound good at the time. There's a huge amount of great casting. And what you sort of pointed out a minute ago was Election had people that weren't stars. 200 Cigarettes had so many stars, but the film still has to resonate. And so I think and during that time, we also fortunately did make some other hits. So, something like, Varsity Blues, which is, again, a film that nobody had great expectations for, but it was combined with those other films, showed that we could appeal directly to the main MTV audience, give them what they wanted, discover stars like James Van Der Beek, and have successes. And in fact, that movie broke all box office records for Martin Luther King's weekend. And all of a sudden, that weekend became important for filmmaking, for releasing films. For the very first time, nobody thought that was a weekend, because people weren't focusing on youth films when we started.
Right.
Not John Hughes was a company targeting a particular audience like we were. But of course, that was our mission.
When you look at big movies now are released on Netflix and streaming platforms, what's the thought process when I put in a movie on TV versus going for box office?
Well, in my personal experience, we never released anything directly to TV. In fact, we had a TV division that was making TV movies and run by Maggie Molina. And, her first film was called Carmen, a hip opera with Beyonce. And she went on to make a lot of MTV direct-to-TV films. And
your division was purely going to box office?
Yes. It was way before the days of streaming. And we're talking the mid-90s and early 2000s. There was no streaming. And even, the sort of respect that films had versus, direct-to-TV movies was, people had high expectations for feature films. I could pontificate about what's going on today, but probably not what it's about. And I would say but I will say generally that line between what's theatrical and what's direct for stream or television, whatever you want to call it these days, is gone, right? So now it just becomes about optimizing your profits and making sure that you don't spend too much money for whatever you're doing. Netflix can spend $300 million on a movie, and that's okay. That's their business model. We couldn't do that. And in fact, the key to MTV's success, and we made all those movies, 27 or so movies, and all of them were profitable, every one of them. And that's not because, we had big hits over and over again. We made them really cheap.
Gotcha.
I was going to say, did you have like a budget cap on films? Was everything under 20 million or even less than that?
Yeah, I mean, most of our films were almost all of our films were under 20, but there were a few outliers. The Longest Yard was probably the biggest outlier. And other than that, I think, it's funny because sometimes, we fought against making movies in that way. And when you are pressured to make movies of that size, then you need stars and you need IP or other things. And so the formula for us was to discover things and to make sure. So if you're going to make, the original Kings of Comedy or Pootie Tang or Election or Napoleon Dynamite, you're going to release that one, you better make them cheap because they are risky. Right. And so as a result, when they succeed, they're really profitable. And when they fail theatrically, at that time, there were so many different revenue streams that you could make your money back. And we always did. So if you looked at the slate of MTV Films versus Paramount slate, you're going to see a much higher profit ratio. They didn't all have to be massive hits. It was, but you like a hit, of course. That feels really good.
When you were mentioning some of the movies, the ones that got got away. How much did you fight for those? Did you not realize at that point? Obviously, you didn't realize how big they would have become, but you mentioned some massive movies that are kind of iconic today.
I mean, it was really, your history is whatever happened, not what could have happened. And
Yeah.
a lot of us live our lives in those moments of, God, that one got away. And in movies, that happens often. And sometimes you say yes to something that you shouldn't have. And sometimes you say no to something that you shouldn't. But in our case, we really did have our ear to the ground on great sort of youth-driven films or unique films. And I don't want to just say youth-driven because, like I was saying, Election, while youth-driven on one level, wasn't. Original Kings of Comedy, not a youth film. There were films that we wanted to do that sort of were about the brand building. And brand building is about not being obvious and sort of showing the world that you have a distinct sensibility. I think A24 is doing that today. But when you really look at Paramount, Warner Brothers, Universal, nobody knows which films came out of those studios unless you happen to be in the business. So the audience doesn't care. So when they release a film, there's no goodwill. With MTV, it's really important to keep building that goodwill and do not squander it. And so you can have some failures. Again, if they're failures with something unique about them that sort of sticks with people or becomes a meme or a joke, Sarate, then you end up sort of burnishing your brand. But if you go to the obvious, then people are like, oh, roll their eyes. We know what we're going to get from there. So it was something that we had to kind of live with, the fact that we couldn't always do what we wanted. But, some of those films, like I mentioned, Juno, I thought would have been a great MTV film. It was so on point, but they were so afraid of an abortion comedy, which it wasn't, but it was, the topic was too tricky. It was R-rated, which most of our films were, frankly. But, the one that is the story of Twilight is the one that is the most heartbreaking and the most difficult to talk about sometimes. I mean, I'm fine with it now, but it was that moment it was the beginning of the end for MTV Films because we had optioned the book as a manuscript. So it hadn't been published yet. It seemed like, it was just in Gap.
Who read it to say that this is something we should be doing?
There were a couple of producers out there that had read the book and brought it to us. They actually worked for Maverick, which was Guy Oseari's company, from a music company. And they loved the book. They had gotten, that's what happens in our business. The agents who represent unpublished manuscripts that are going to get published, that was going to get published. They send it to Hollywood producers and studios, and then you try to get them before they get published because then it becomes too difficult if they're successes, and if they're failures, then nobody really cares. So in this case, it was an obviously interesting book for us, but it hadn't been published. We started to develop it, and the first draft, the studio was like, no, we need to make it like a little bit more like Underworld, which was a success at the time. Everybody's looking for like the last movie that was big success. Make it like that. Make it like Underworld. Well, that was not a good direction, and this first script wasn't great, but then everybody got fired at Paramount. Like the whole regime changed. And so that's a thing that happens in Hollywood in the movie business that you have no control over. And literally everybody we worked with, for the most part, was gone. And so this is another typical move, which is the new people decide they need to have their own mark and they get rid of everything on the slate. Well, we were MTV. We were a separate entity. I didn't work for Paramount. They weren't my bosses. We had this book. It was already published. It was a phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So why would they not make it, you might ask? Well, because they have other agendas, including making sure that their mark is on everything. And so they forced us to let it go. And the option was coming up. And so we extended the option for a little time to sort of allow the producers who brought it to us to not be screwed over. And they brought it to a former executive that we worked with at Paramount. And she brought it to Summit, which made the movie. And $4 billion franchise later, Paramount missed out and MTV missed out on probably the most important young youth franchise in the last, I don't know, maybe ever. And
Yeah.
so it's one of those things. And the sad part about all of this was it didn't have to be that way, but it was the writing on the wall for me, because you can't have a viable job, as great a job as it was, a fantastic 10-year run. And so we were in the 11th year, and all right, this is time for me to go. And I left, and actually didn't leave MTV. I was kind of fed up at that moment with the movie business. And so Van said, what do you want to do? And I'm like, this digital thing, I think there's something there with YouTube was just starting and Facebook was just starting. And I'm like, there's something in this world, and there's a lot of talent in it. And I can just be free again to do what MTV does best and not be under sort of the thumb of studio executives who don't know our brand.
Yeah. Did somebody take over MTV Films at that time, or did it sort of just start to slowly dissipate?
Well, we'll save the ugly details for
Okay.
my book, which I'm not writing, but maybe one day, where I name names. But, they hired somebody who would be willing to work for Paramount and MTV at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
and try to find that happy balance between what a studio wants and what MTV wants. And that didn't work out. A year later, he was gone. And what they did after that was slap the label on a few movies. My last film there was Blades of Glory. And and that was the last thing I had my hands on. And then from there, I don't even know what came out. There were a couple that they put the brand on, but it just died eventually.
And now you see it everywhere on all my favorite Paramount Plus shows.
Yeah, which is really weird. I mean, the MTV was, had the people that were at MTV that ultimately went to Paramount, like Chris McCarthy, I think, and George Cheeks and Brian Robbins, who was he actually directed Varsity Blues and coached, and it was produced Coach Carter with me. And I think that they knew that the brand was still really important. And so, but it was weird because it was put on, all these shows that have nothing to do with anything MTV, but I can't explain that one.
Yeah. So I just want to ask you a few quick fire questions.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay.
What's your favorite movie?
In life?
Yeah.
Saturday Night Fever.
Okay.
So that's my favorite movie. And that inspired me to get into the business. And I've watched it over and over again. And it's still a great movie.
When was the last time you watched it?
I think I watched it about a year ago. It holds up incredibly well.
Yeah, I have a few of those. Do you have a piece of MTV swag from a production you worked on?
It's funny. I almost wore something today, but I have a lot of swag. We've got everything from, the Jackass movies to The Wood to Kings of Comedy. There was a lot, Hustle and Flow. Each of those movies has such a great memory for me. So every once in a while I bring out a sweatshirt or.
Right. But anything at your level that you would have got like a piece of the set or a piece of the wardrobe or something big like that?
I wasn't that thoughtful at the time, but I think I have a Varsity Blues football somewhere.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Wow. Favorite movie screening venue?
Favorite movie? There are two in LA that are amazing. There's the Chinese, where we did premiere a lot of our movies. So the famous Grauman's, now it's called something else, Chinese Theater, and the Egyptian, which is now a Cinematheque, they're both from that 1920s era, and they're movie palaces, and we still have some of them in LA.
I've only seen one movie at Grauman's. It was Wayne's World.
It's really, that is a fun place. It's got almost 2,000 people. And when the movie's a success, and there's a big audience there, it's interactive. It's amazing.
If you could go back and produce a sequel for an MTV film, what would it be?
You know, for the most part, we had a rule that we don't make sequels. And it wasn't because they can't be successful, and sometimes they can, but it's that attitude about just stop, don't repeat yourself. And that was something that MTV sort of stuck to. Obviously, the economics of things, and they've Jackass has become a real franchise, of course. And so a movie like that, which kind of lends itself to continuous surprises and outrage, is actually sort of a good thing. But the answer is there is an election in development, a sequel. I'm not personally involved in it, but that sort of takes place like 30 years later. And
I was just going to ask you, where would Tracy Flick be today?
well, maybe you'll learn the answer to that.
Last question on this. What was the last series you binged?
Yeah, I think, you know what's weird is I'm binging right now a series that's 25 years old, which is The Wire, because I never ended up seeing it.
Oh.
And people are like, I'm jealous, you're getting to see The Wire for the first time. But I think I really love this little series that's on Disney Plus called Wonder Man. It's short.
Oh, I just started that actually this week. I just was like,
It's a wonderful little series that is very meta but very fun.
I am a sucker for anything Marvel, superhero, powers, any of that stuff.
Michael B. Jordan is in The Wire.
Is I was looking at I just looked up his character because I'm like, oh my God, is that Michael B. Jordan? And he's a teenager. He's young in that.
Wow. Do you think he's going to win the Oscar? Well, by the time this airs, we will have known, but
you know, I think there's a really good chance that Sinners will win the Oscar. Everybody's talking it's between that and One Battle After Another. And I unfortunately, on some level, it's usually what you predict, but I really love Frankenstein. I thought that movie was extraordinary.
Yeah. And I just watched that the Leo movie last night. I just watched it last night.
It's a really well constructed, incredibly
well long, so I was like, my wife's out of town. I'm just gonna go through it.
Are you an Academy member?
Oh, that's another long story.
Okay.
We don't need to, again, the book. Wait for the book.
Of all the talent who came through MTV Films early in their career, the Mike Whites, Alexander Paynes, Reese Witherspoon, Justin Lin, is there one that stands out that makes you like really proud that MTV Films saw something in them so early and took a chance on them?
Well, I think there were people all along the way that I think had their own sort of notoriety. And we discovered Jason Segel in his high school performance at Harvard Westlake School, and he was he was an 18-year-old teenager. I'd say that Kate Hudson is somebody whom I remember seeing in the first in her audition. I'm like, oh my God, she's amazing. Just everything about her is amazing. And of course, she's now nominated for an Academy Award.
Yeah.
And she's remarkable, and I think Reese is the most obvious, even though I think we were a second movie. When you find a vehicle for somebody, not just that they're a great actor, and ultimately you see that in their performance, which is not that challenging, but seeing something with somebody with the kind of star quality that you just gravitate towards. And Reese, of course, is the big one on that, and that score. Yeah. And you just end up, that's the beauty of having so many films and doing it for so long. You come across great people. So that's my answer to that.
Amazing. So as we end, always like to dig into life after MTV. And we all know the entertainment business can be so fickle with jobs and companies, leaders come and go. Where do they go next? So what was your career path and want to just touch
I'll
on
do
a
the
little
short
bit?
version. So after MTV Films, as I mentioned, I went to MT to launch a new digital division in the moment in time when everything was going digital. But to be honest, MTV didn't really have the foresight for transitioning into digital media and entertainment. They sued YouTube and we couldn't even work with them. But that was a great next 7 years. I spent 18 years altogether at MTV. And then I went to start my own company called We Are the Mighty. And that was the first time I actually went out on my own, and sort of like MTV, looking for underserved audiences. We focused on the military community and veterans and helping veterans transition from their military careers into entertainment. And we sold that company. And then I actually went back to work for Van Toffler and at Gunpowder and Sky, and did that for a few years, developed films and shows and documentaries and a bunch of other stuff. And now, as the film business sort of is in a crisis, the whole entertainment business is in a crisis. For the last few years, I've been a coach helping people with career transitions. And that's very rewarding and perfect for me right now because I have something to offer. I don't have to still fight the fight in entertainment, and I can help people who see that their future may or may not be in entertainment, but they don't necessarily recognize all the things that made them successful to begin with that can be transferred to other areas or repositioned so that they are relevant and they're excited and passionate about their career. So that's what I do now. And including, every once in a while I have a movie or a show that I'm producing.
I think someone that's gone through career change and doubting themselves, you go through a period of rejection and you need that voice. So I can see how what you're doing now is very, very beneficial. And, you have experience of being a leader and transition to various companies. So I'm sure you have a lot to offer.
Thank you. I really love helping people out, and especially, people who have so much more to offer, and ultimately the businesses change or things change in their lives. And I learned over and over again that what seems like a disaster at the time, you get fired, regimes change, times change, technologies change, and you think this is the end. And so reinventing yourself or introducing yourself is such an important part of our lives, but we don't know it at the time how much we've learned from it. And so my job is to help people sort of be able to reflect and revisit their careers in ways that bring out the best in them. And that's something that I had to do on my own. I didn't have anybody helping me, but transition is good.
Yeah. It's sort of like developing a script, right? You're sort of just like figuring out the pieces that work and kind of moving forward with that.
Yeah, I equate making movies to your career and good movies to your career. Like a good movie, you don't know what's the ending. You don't know how this disaster or this terrible moment is going to turn out. And that's what happens in careers. And the process of making a movie is filled with so many disappointments and high moments, low moments. And when you're in the low moment, it's very hard sometimes to see through all of that. And I'm old enough to have been through many of them.
Well, that's all we have for you, David.
Thank you.
I hope that wasn't too difficult.
No, it was not hard at all. And one thing I didn't do, but there were so many people at MTV itself that were so integral to what we did successfully, especially the groups in the marketing department. And and you've had some of these people, on the show. And so, and some you should have on the show, Christina Norman and Tina Exaros and Amy Finnerty and you had Robin Reinhardt, they're Kevin McCall, Kevin Mangini, if I mentioned them. They were the people making these interstitials, helping market the movies, enjoying them, our biggest fans, and everything about, working at MTV sort of was there. We weren't just isolated in Los Angeles. We worked directly with everybody, at the net.
Well, that was one of the best things about MTV because you did have that synergy, and what you were doing in films could be promoted on MTV. And it wasn't just with, running ads. It was, contesting. It was TRL. It was movie specials. It was, appearances on award shows. It was so many different things that you could do with the talent involved that it just gave you that much more opportunity to get the name
promotion
of the
was
film in
endless.
front of people.
Yeah, and that was a superpower. We sold that superpower to all kinds of studios, and it was a huge moneymaker. And there was entire departments that were created just to promote movies. But we were the beginning of that with those interstitials. Clueless was actually the very first one they did, which was not. It was before we had MTV Films. But every film we did, they were sort of refining that approach to making a movie become something that people were talking about, and Napoleon Dynamite being the perfect example, because that Vote for Pedro campaign with Napoleon on TRL and sort of sneaking him into places with the audience just scratching their heads was a brilliant campaign that turned that movie into something that's still being shown all the time, and young people get to see it and relive it. And that was all because of MTV. The studio gave MTV all the credit for building that brilliant campaign.
Yeah, that's where you really tap into the brand. And yes, you wanted to distinguish yourself as a separate entity, but when you have that brand to help you promote, there's nothing big.
So important. And the one I'm most proud of actually is Murderball, because for people who haven't seen the movie, it's a wonderful documentary about these men who play wheelchair rugby, all having had the spinal cord injuries. And MTV did a special with the Jackass folks, and they launched people off their wheelchairs into lakes. And the Jackass guys loved doing this, and they were exactly the kind of people that could normalize and sort of make people aware that people in wheelchairs are just like everybody else. And so they were the right age. And so it was, and the movie went on to get an Academy Award nomination. And I really attribute a lot of that to MTV's campaign and embracing of the movie, while our audience got to see a world that they don't normally get exposed to in a way that really made it accessible.
Yeah.
Hey, did you get to go to the Oscars the year that 3-6 Mafia won for Hustle
I did.
and Flow?
Yeah.
It must have been exciting to be there to see one of your films win an Academy Award.
Yeah. We were nominated a few times, for Academy Awards, but that's the first win, and nobody was expecting It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp to win the Oscar for Best Song. And it's still probably one of those scratch your head moments.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys.
Well, again, thank you, David. We really appreciate it. And for people listening, please rate, review, like, and share the podcast. And we will have another episode coming up soon.
Thank you,
All
guys.
Right. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you, David.
You.